I'm Amina, and I was 17 when I made the pilgrimage to Mecca, the sacred journey that every Muslim child grows up dreaming about. Growing up in Lahore, Pakistan, in our tiny home that always smelled like my mother's fragrant biryani and echoed with my father's evening prayers, Hajj was my ultimate fantasy. I'd sit on the floor with my legs crossed, listening to Baba tell magical stories about the Kaaba, how its sacred black stone contained generations of worship, how the pilgrims moved together like one beating heart, bound by their shared faith. He'd run his fingers through my hair and whisper, "Amina, someday you'll make this journey, and Allah will cleanse your spirit completely." When my family sacrificed everything they owned to send me, I felt like I was carrying all their hopes on my shoulders. I was the special one, the daughter who would make them proud. Walking into Mecca felt like stepping into a living dream. The atmosphere was dense with sweltering heat, saturated with the fragrances of oud and rosewater. The constant chanting of Labbaik, Allahumma Labbaik resonated like an eternal melody that had been sung since the beginning of time. I was overwhelmed with wonder, my pulse racing as I witnessed the Kaaba for the first time, its black covering glittering beneath the blazing sun. I felt incredibly tiny, yet deeply connected, as if I were part of something boundless. I'd rise before sunrise, excited to join the ocean of white-robed pilgrims, my abaya sweeping around my feet as I moved, my mouth softly reciting prayers I'd known by heart since I was small. I was prepared to complete the fifth pillar of Islam, to stand in Allah's presence, clean and complete. My heart wasn't merely full, it was bursting with joy. But that beautiful dream crumbled on the third day. The masses during Tawaf were overwhelming, a churning whirlpool of bodies crushing against one another. I was walking with my aunt and cousins, gripping my aunt's hand firmly, but the crowd was merciless. One second her fingers were intertwined with mine, the next moment they had vanished. I shouted out, "Kala Aisha!" but my voice disappeared into the thunder of prayers and marching feet. My chest constricted, my breathing became shallow as I fought through the crowd, desperately searching for their recognizable faces. I was isolated, a 17-year-old girl surrounded by thousands of strangers, my heart hammering with terror. Then someone seized my arm. I turned around quickly, hoping to see my cousin, but instead found a man, older, probably in his 40s. His face was worn, his gaze harsh. He was dressed in the white ihram like every other pilgrim, but something about him felt dangerous.
"Lost little sister," he said, his tone smooth yet menacing. "I'll help you locate your family."
I was terrified, but I agreed, desperately hoping he was a righteous Muslim, a brother in faith. He guided me away from the Kaaba through smaller pathways, past tents fluttering in the arid breeze. My stomach twisted with unease, but I convinced myself to trust him. This was Hajj, the most sacred place on earth. Nothing terrible could possibly happen here. I was completely mistaken. In a secluded spot, far from the crowds, he forced me against a wall. His hands were brutal, ripping at my abaya. I screamed, but the sound vanished into the distant murmur of prayers. I fought back, my fingernails cutting into his arms, but he was far too powerful. I pleaded, "Please, for Allah's sake, stop." But his eyes were vacant, as if he couldn't hear my words. At 17, in the most holy place I'd ever known, I was sexually assaulted. My body felt like it no longer belonged to me, like I was observing it happen from somewhere distant. When it ended, he simply walked away, melting back into the crowd, leaving me broken on the ground, my abaya ripped, my soul destroyed. I don't remember how I managed to stumble back to my aunt. My legs were trembling, my face covered with tears and dirt. When I whispered what had happened, my voice barely audible, she struck me so hard my ears were ringing.
"How could you allow this to happen? You've brought disgrace upon us all."
Disgrace. That word was a blade piercing my heart. I was the one who'd been violated, yet I was the one being blamed. I went to the officials, my hands shaking as I recounted what occurred.
But they barely acknowledged me. "No witnesses," they said. "No evidence. Don't stain the holiness of Hajj with such accusations."
My family ordered me to stay silent, to preserve our honor. Honor. As if I had any remaining after what that man had stolen from me. That night I knelt on my prayer rug, my body aching, my heart weighted down. I pleaded with Allah for understanding. Why did this happen? Where was his protection? I'd come to his house, pure and devoted, and this was my reward. I waited for a sign, a whisper of consolation. but there was nothing, just silence, cold and oppressive. For the first time in my life, I felt deserted by the God I'd loved so intensely. Back in Lahore, the nightmares arrived every night. I'd wake up screaming, feeling his hands on me, smelling the dust from that corner. I stopped praying. The words I'd once treasured, Allahu Akbar, Subhanallah, felt like deceptions. How could I pray to a God who allowed this to happen in his sacred place? My mother noticed, her eyes narrowing as she watched me skip Salah.
"What's wrong with you, Amina?" she'd demand, her voice cutting.
I couldn't tell her. The shame was too overwhelming, the fear of her rejection too real. I began asking questions quietly at first. Why did the Imam say women must cover to avoid tempting men, as if my body was the transgression? Why did the community whisper about me, calling me damaged when I was the one who'd been harmed? I studied the Quran, desperate for answers, but discovered verses that bewildered me. Rules about women's submission, punishments that seemed cruel. I examined hadith, but some stories made me sick, especially the ones about women's position in society. The more I studied, the more I noticed fractures in the faith I'd once held so firmly. One day, my best friend Sarah visited. We'd grown up together, praying beside each other, giggling about boys we'd never dare approach. She found me sitting in my room surrounded by books, my hijab thrown on the floor.
Amina, you've transformed, she said, her voice gentle with concern. You don't attend the mosque anymore. What's happened to you?
The words poured out before I could control them. I was raped, Sarah, in Mecca during Hajj, and everyone, absolutely everyone, blamed me. Where was Allah? Where was his compassion? My voice cracked, tears flowing down my cheeks. Sarah reached for my hand, but I pulled back.
You can't blame God for one man's evil, she said. Have faith, Amina.
Faith. The word burned. Faith hadn't protected me. Faith hadn't delivered justice. All it brought was silence and shame. I couldn't continue living like that. At university, I found sanctuary in the library, consuming books that expanded my mind. Nietzsche's words about questioning everything struck me like lightning. Dawkins challenged the concept of a loving God. Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story resonated with my own, a woman who'd suffered under the burden of faith and discovered freedom by letting go. I began to see Islam not as divine truth, but as a system created by men, one that often destroyed women like me. It was frightening to question everything I'd been raised to believe, but it was also like breathing for the first time. Leaving Islam wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, torturous unraveling. I stopped wearing my hijab, and my mother's eyes filled with tears. "You're breaking my heart," she said. When I told my family I no longer believed, my father's expression turned to stone. "You're no daughter of mine," he said, his voice ice cold. "They abandoned me." Their doors slammed shut. Sarah stopped calling. The community I'd once cherished turned away. I was alone, but I was also liberated. I moved to a new country at 22, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of wounds. I began writing, pouring my anguish onto pages, sharing my story online. I discovered others, ex-Muslims, survivors, people who'd been rejected for daring to question. They became my new family, one that didn't demand my silence. I learned to love myself not as a Muslim, not as a victim, but as Amina, a woman who survived, who questioned, who rebuilt her existence. I'm 25 now, living in a small apartment where sunlight pours through the windows. The nightmares still visit sometimes, but they're gentler now. I carry the scars from that day in Mecca, but they don't control me. I do. I found peace in my own truth, in the courage it took to walk away from a faith that failed me. I'm not the girl who dreamed of Hajj anymore. I'm a woman who dreams of a world where no one is silenced, where no one is shamed for their pain. And for the first time in years, I'm not just surviving, I'm truly living.